The point of this video is to give people an understanding of all of the moving parts going on in neutral. Everyone's neutral can use some help, but more importantly, analyzing these concepts will give you better insight and understanding as to why you are losing neutral in some situations. You can then use this information to counter an opponent's approach or take advantage of an opponent's tendencies. The fighting game glossary defines neutral as the stage of a fight where neither player is blocking or getting hit by anything, and you are trying to figure out the best way to start or continue your game plan. In neutral, there are three primary ways to interact with your opponent: pokes, jumps, and anti-airs. There are many variables to how these three options interact with each other, but let's begin with the core principles. Pokes are defined as an attack that's thrown out to occupy the horizontal space in front of you, and remind your opponent not to try and come closer. A jump is exactly what it sounds like, making your character leap into the air. A jump takes vertical space and threatens an attack from above. Finally, an anti-air is the act of hitting someone who is jumping at you. This is often with moves that occupy vertical space. There's much more that we're going to get into, but at its very core, neutral is comprised of these three options: pokes, jumps, and anti-airs. Pokes, which threaten horizontal space but not vertical space; jumps, which avoid horizontal space and occupy vertical space; and anti-airs, which threaten vertical space but cannot reliably threaten horizontal space. In turn, pokes beat anti-airs but lose to jumps. Jumps beat pokes but lose to anti-airs, and anti-airs beat jumps but lose to pokes. It's important to understand these three principles of neutral because it will often let you know how to play around an option, even in the moment. Take the nuance away from an attack and it's simply a hitbox. Instead of being overwhelmed by an option and writing it off as broken, you can beat something just by knowing this simple knowledge. Ramlethal 5S and 5H are very strong pokes. Instead of challenging their horizontal space, occupy the vertical space with a jump. Gold Lewis has very strong jumping normals that can oppress you from the vertical space. Instead of giving up that space and putting yourself in the corner, challenge their space with an anti-air. I provide an example for anti-airs, but it's better if I wait until we get into more nuanced approaches to neutral. All of this being said, neutral is not a simple game of rock, paper, scissors. There isn't a unified poke, jump, or anti-air. Guilty Gear Strive has a wide variety of toolkits in which certain characters are stronger in one area of neutral over another. Moreover, there's no such thing as a conventional tie in neutral like a game of RPS. If both characters use a poke, they do not both guess again to see who gets to start their offense. Systematically, there are many different types of pokes, jumps, and anti-airs that work better or worse against one another. Let's go over how this works, starting with pokes. Pokes are going to be different in frame data, hitbox, hurtbox, active frames, and recovery frames, making certain pokes more advantageous to use against one another. I just used a lot of FGC lingo, so let's quickly define these terms. Simply put, frame data is the speed of a move, hitbox is the space that is occupied by the move that will hit your opponent if they enter, hurtbox is the space where your character can be hit during the move, active frames are how long the hitbox stays out before going away, and recovery frames are how long it takes for your character to be able to block after whiffing a move. If two pokes are used at the same time and the hitboxes will both reach the opponent's hurtbox, it's going to come down to whose move is faster, aka the frame data. So Gold Lewis has a far slash that's 10 frames, and Ramlethal has a far slash that's 11 frames. At round start, both of these hitboxes will reach the other's hurtbox, and therefore, theoretically, if we press the button at the same time, I should win by 1 frame. I'm going to restart now. There you go, I got a counter hit. Hitbox and hurtboxes matter because they affect how pokes interact with each other. There are 4 primary pokes. The first is the typical poke, that is fast and mid-ranged, in which the hitbox will cover a lot of horizontal space. Usually, this is a far slash for a mid poke, or a 2D or 2S for a low poke. The second is called a low profile, which occupies very little vertical space, but lowers the hurt box of the character significantly so that it cannot be hit by typical pokes. Effectively, this is a poke that will beat mid-pokes. The third is called a disjoint, in which the hitbox extends beyond the hurt box, making it a poke that beats typical pokes. These are generally long-ranged with more active and recovery frames, such as Ramethhal's 5S and 5H that we saw earlier, but every character has a universal disjoint in their 6P, which is a short-ranged, active counterpoke tool for mid and high pokes. This doesn't apply to Gold Lewis. Active frames determine how long a hitbox stays out and therefore prevents the opponent from entering your space until this is over. But where there are more active frames, there's usually more recovery. The higher recovery on a move, the easier it is to punish on whiff with a counterpoke. Finally, the fourth poke is the projectile. A projectile is the best way to take horizontal space from afar. I know what you're thinking, a projectile shouldn't be a poke, but you should think of a projectile as a disjointed, moving poke that leaves the character's hurtbox. Projectiles are used to deny space, and like any other poke, their weakness is going to be occupying vertical space in anticipation for the poke to come out. Projectiles are very strong in occupying the horizontal space and can zone you into the air, allowing for the opponent to anti-air you or force you to block. Projectiles have the largest range of any of the pokes and are at their strongest when used from far away. You can deny this option by playing close to your opponent or, once again, playing in the air. Next, we can talk about the nuances of the jump. First, once again, all jumps are not built equally. Jumps can range in height, speed, and follow-up options. Height and speed are pretty self-explanatory. It's better to jump higher than lower. Note that every character has a super jump to get higher than usual. It is better to rise and fall fast than it is to rise and fall slowly. The most important aspect of a jump is the follow-up options. First, a jump does not always need to lead to an aerial attack. It's simply a way to threaten an aerial attack. This means that it's completely fine to jump and simply land without doing anything, because even without pressing a button, your jump threatened the opponent's vertical space and might bait out an anti-air. Second, the jumping normals that your character has is important to how your character can navigate the vertical space. Gold Lewis, for example, has 3 very strong jumping normals. His JS covers the vertical space, his JD covers the horizontal space, and his JH covers the space directly underneath him. Finally, and arguably the most important follow-up option to a jump, is a way to change your trajectory and/or momentum in the air. This can take place in a double or triple jump, in an air dash or double air dash, or a normal or special move. Although anti-airs counter jumps, you don't have to make it easy for them. Changing your jumping approach with these options are the best way to keep the opponent confused on their anti-air timing. Once again, there are hardly ever ties when it comes to neutral. When both characters jump, it's going to come down to the same ideas we discussed earlier, but for simplicity, let's focus on hitboxes and frame data. Where you are in the air compared to your opponent matters tremendously when it comes to air-to-air situations. Although there are no low profiles in the sky, we still have hitboxes with various frame data to deny the opponent from entering the space. First, when you're very close to the opponent, you can air throw as the fastest option. This cannot be blocked, but can be teched if both people throw at the same time. When you're already close, but moving closer to the enemy, it is better to use your fastest aerial normal, JP. Anything beyond this is going to be specific to the character you're using, but generally, you want to view your opponent's trajectory in the air and use the best hitbox for the situation. Finally, we can talk about anti-airs, which are a lot more nuanced than you'd think. In Guilty Gear Strive, there is a universal anti-air in 6P that effectively gives you a low-profile hurtbox and allows you to punish aerial approaches. However, similarly to what we've seen earlier, the hitboxes on 6Ps are not universal. Some 6Ps are strong at covering IED jump-ins, some 6Ps are strong at covering directly above, and some are in between. Also, we mentioned earlier that low profiles could beat mid to long range pokes, and the 6P is no exception. This might seem contradictory, seeing as how I said that horizontal pokes should beat anti-airs because anti-airs are designed to challenge vertical space, but in this case it's not. Just because the hurt box is lower does not mean that the hitbox is as well, because in low profiles the hitbox and hurt box are lowered. 6Ps have a very low hurt box and a very high hitbox. Any poke that hits low will easily beat a 6P. Regardless, you should know that using 6P against a poke is very difficult to do on reaction and will often only work as a preemptive response to another poke. In this sense, 6P is not only an anti-air, but a counter poke tool for mid and high pokes. There are also character-specific special moves that are designed to be used as anti-airs given their hitboxes and hurt boxes. For example, Nagoriyuki 623H and Giovanna's 623S. Moreover, anti-airs do not always have to have low-profile hurt boxes. Though it helps, it is not always the best option, especially if your opponent is approaching from the weaknesses in your 6P. An anti-air is simply an attack that covers a vertical space that your opponent is approaching from. Every character in the game can anti-air an IED jump in with a 5P. Some 5Ps will be better than this than others, depending on active frames and hitbox, but it is a strong tool on all characters. Other non-disjointed anti-airs are generally character-specific. For example, Nagoriyuki can anti-air top-down approaches with his close slash, and Sol can anti-air IEDs with his 3-frame 5K. Finally, an anti-air does not necessarily need to be a grounded move. Jumping can often be the best way to punish an opponent for approaching in the air. If they get too close without using an aerial attack, JP or air throw can punish them. If your opponent has been altering their trajectory and momentum in the air, jumping in response to their jump can be a very good option to stop their approach. We now know the 3 basic options to interact with your opponent during neutral, including how pokes, jumps, and anti-airs work against each other, the nuances within each of these 3 options, and how characters can be stronger or weaker in each of these options depending on their normals, specials, aerial options, and 6P. However, there's one final tool in neutral that can be used to both increase the strength of and even counter these options: movement. Movement is simply the act of moving your character. What's hard to figure out about that? Well, it turns out that movement can beat all 3 of the previously stated neutral options. We discussed this a bit during the jump section. You can use aerial movement tools to get your opponent to whiff an anti-air and then punish accordingly. This concept also applies to pokes and anti-airs. If you stay unpredictable with your movement, you can bait anti-airs during a jump, bait pokes on the ground, and punish jumps on the ground. I'm being pretty vague with the word movement, so let's get a little more specific. What makes good movement? Good movement is all about playing your character's effective ranges and attempting to stay around that range without giving your opponent too much ground. The next level beyond this is understanding your opponent's effective ranges and playing around them. Ultimately, this comes down to 2 tangible concepts: spacing and approaches. You can also look at this as being reactive or proactive. When you understand yours versus your opponent's effective ranges, you will need to apply spacing. Spacing is the area on screen between you and your opponent. When you're consciously spacing, you're playing reactively to what your opponent does. Let me give you a specific example with the character that is most talked about in this channel, Nagoriyuki. In the Nagoriyuki versus Leo matchup, Nagoriyuki wants to play at 2 different ranges. First is going to be the close range. Naga wants to play at the tip of his 2S or the tip of his far S. Second, when far, Naga wants to play at a range where he can react to Leo's fireball with a 214 HS spin and hit it with a disjoint. On the other hand, the Leo doesn't want to play at these ranges. He would rather be right outside of Naga's far slash range so that he can punish a whiffed move. From far, he wants to play at pretty much full screen where the Naga cannot reach him with his 214 HS disjoint, so that he can use an H fireball to win the horizontal space. For the Nagoriyuki, his spacing is a balancing act of trying to stay at this range and reacting to Leo's approaches or disengagements. For the Leo, his spacing is a balancing act of baiting out a whiffed poke or making enough space to get out an H fireball. Because of the strong horizontal presence Nagoriyuki has, and Leo being a character focused on ground play, the neutral in this matchup is favored for Nagoriyuki. Now that we understand the spaces that the characters want to occupy, let's talk about their approach options, the proactive part of neutral. The Nagoriyuki has the approach options of 214 HS and Fukyo into normals, both of which are grounded. Approaching in the air in this matchup is not advised for the Nagoriyuki. Leo has the approach options of a strong dash into big normals, a jump in, 236S, or H fireball. Leo has the stronger approach options, so he will likely be the one with the proactive game plan from the start. So, when do we switch from being reactive to proactive? Generally, someone from the very beginning of the round will show aggression and the other person will choose to challenge, meaning someone will get hit, or play reactively. In the case that both players play passively from the beginning, someone will eventually have to make the first approach. When it comes to the middle of the match, the interesting part of the reactive versus proactive dynamic is that the opponent's intentions can often be vague. They can be spacing very well and then pick a moment to pounce, or they can seem like they want to approach, but really they're trying to bait out a move for you to whiff. Ultimately, what it comes down to is picking up on your opponent's approach habits and countering it. On the other hand, you should be mixing your approach options to stay unpredictable. When you're both switching it up, it becomes a match of who has the better read in the moment. All this being said, we still have one more thing to talk about, and I swear I won't take much more of your time. We are playing Guilty Gear Strive, and Guilty Gear has one major system mechanic that drastically affects how neutral is played: the Roman cancel. When it comes to neutral, every Roman cancel has its use. The first is PRC, and it's used to cancel the end leg of a move, even on whiff. If your opponent baited you into whiffing an anti-air poke, use meter and now you're safe. If Leo wants to get out his H fireball, he can now do that much more safely as well. Next, we have red RC. Sometimes you get your opponent to block something, but you aren't necessarily in the best position to continue pressure after it. Using red RC can make you plus and give you an opportunity to get your game plan started. Alternatively, if your opponent made a solid approach and began their offense, turn it around on them by using YRC to end their turn and make yourself plus. Finally, we have BRC, which will drastically slow down your opponent and put them into a guessing situation where you can strike, throw, or simply get your turn started. This is effective as an approach option on a landing opponent, or on an opponent who isn't moving enough on the ground. And that's all I've got. Thank you so much for tuning into this video. This is my first non-character specific guide, and I look forward to making more. If you enjoyed this video, consider liking and subscribing. If you want notifications on future streams and videos, join the community Discord. It's also the best place to suggest videos and ask me questions directly. I also stream on Twitch, so if you want to see me live in action, follow me over there. If you want to support what I do, consider joining my Patreon. Once again, thanks for supporting my content. See you soon. Until we meet again, that's all I've got. Bye-bye.